Okay, it just happened. The buttons were pressed. And here we are, you and me, together in this asynchronous auditory moment. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome anybody new, and what's up everybody else? How's everybody doing? The saga continues. The saga of, I guess, this pandemic. I actually don't want to talk about that. It's hard to not have that always be the thing. I know I've been giving these weekly updates about everything that's going on and the decisions that have to be made. And it's not that all of that's not still important. It's just that sometimes I need to not be talking about that, And that is very much what today's conversation with T.S. Little is about. You'll hear for yourself that T.S. is also encouraging a, not denial, but an embracing of the imaginary realm, as he calls it. I'll say a little bit more about that conversation in just a bit, but I really have been needing to have a counter to all of this, More and more I'm taking a sort of solace and a sort of refuge in my practice that, I don't know, it's changing. This situation, this persistent, continued, strained situation is shaping my practice quite a bit. One thing about it that I'm going to mention, because it actually is a good foreshadowing of some other conversations that you're going to be listening to over the next few weeks. Just earlier today, I was having a conversation with a new friend. He's a philosophy professor, and he was talking about what he called objective commitments. How if you believe a certain thing to be true, you commit yourself to that in some way. You say, yes, this is true. I assert this to be the truth as I know it, that you've committed to that. And that very often certain beliefs or ideas that you commit to, they lead to other commitments as well. Like if you believe this thing to be true, then it also means that you would believe this to be true. And then at some point, you've committed yourself to all kinds of ideas or even a way of being or seeing, and sometimes you maybe did that consciously, but very often maybe we didn't know that we committed ourselves to this. And I think the hallmark is, are you allowed to change your mind? Can you change your mind about any of your beliefs if you wanted to? Or are you so locked in that would never even be possible? I don't know, that's kind of vague. I don't know if that means anything to anybody else at all, or even why I'm mentioning it out loud, but I'm working through some stuff. You'll hear it in the coming episodes, and you're certainly going to hear some of it in today's talk with T.S. Little. Lately, I've been going back to this list. Maybe some of you remember, I have this list of people that I wrote down that basically were people who I just remember when I first got into yoga, they were already on the scene. People who've been around for longer than me. I remember them always being here. All the time that I've been in the yoga world, these people have always been there. And T.S. is one of those people. So he's been on this list. Someday I got to talk to T.S. Little. And kind of like Max Strom last week, I feel like it happened right in the right moment for me, because he also has gone in this direction of somatic inquiry, and you'll hear like the poetic aspect of the wisdom path, as he calls it. So right at the moment when I feel like I want some of that more, where at other times, honestly, I think I might have felt a little bit resistant, because I think there's a cliche, right? There's a cliche of the yoga teacher who is all about unicorns and rainbows or whatever. There's a cliche about a cheesy, full of it yoga teacher who's talking out their butt, and I've always been really determined to make sure that I don't come off like that. Even though I totally believe in unicorns and rainbows. I totally believe in the unicorns and the rainbows. I just don't want it to come off in that cliche kind of way, I suppose. So, I don't know, things that I would have thought were kind of cheesy not so long ago, right now don't seem cheesy to me at all. And it seems almost like a very practical and wise choice to invite spaces where I'm going to the imaginary realm, as Tias talks about. You're going to hear today. It was really great fun to have this moment to connect with him. I'm excited for you to hear it today. Real quick before we do, let me just mention my stuff. I've got ongoing weekly live stream classes that you could subscribe to from wherever you are in the world. And actually, the most hysterical thing happened in class this week. Maybe I will tell you about that on the other side of today's conversation. Yes, I will. If you stick around to the other side, I will tell you about the most hysterical thing that happened to me this week via my online live stream classes. And there are 4 new classes each week. And if you can't make it to it live, then the most recent class is available anytime, 24/7. I also have this weekly teachers class I do. Amazing group of yoga teachers getting together to really talk about pressing matters and also some education on stuff. Lots of support and inspiration there. Also, I was mentioning new practice videos. The 2nd edition, J. Brown Yoga Practice Videos, is available. And, of course, you can always check out my online workshop, Gentle is the New Advanced. All that stuff can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Also, this episode is brought to you in support by Podcast Premium subscribers. In particular, Nicola Varini and Hannah Glancy. We are so grateful to people like Nicola and Hannah and the rest of our Podcast Premium subscribers, because it really helps. Helps me be able to keep doing this like I'm doing it every week. Not to mention, you also get access to the full archives. Of course, it is a choose your rate, and we will give free accounts to anybody who can't afford it if they email us. But if you enjoy what you get from the show each week and you want to be a part of helping support it, then becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber is the best way to do that. You can find out more about becoming a Podcast Premium subscriber, again, at jbrownyoga.com. All right, y'all. I think we'll just leave it there. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Tias Little. Hello?
Hello.
Hello. Tias.
Yes.
Well, here we are, sir.
Mm-hmm.
On a Monday. We've never met before, really, though. We don't know each other at all. We're strangers of sorts, but not really, because you're on a list of people that I see as the people whose footsteps I have followed in.
Mm.
So, from the time I started in sort of yoga as a thing of mine in the early 90s, your name was always around.
Well, I'm not sure if that's a positive thing or if that's a deleterious thing, but I'm happy to tread the path, and of course there's so many footsteps that I've followed before me. So isn't that what we do? Is we just we take the well-worn path?
Well, it's interesting that you say well-worn path, because when I first started getting into yoga, in the early 90s, it didn't feel like a well-worn path. It felt like a real counterculture move. But you're referring to the well-worn path of like thousands and thousands of years of humanity inquiring into yoga, I think, right?
Well, I think so, and I think we need to be on that path, because of the turbulence today, both in terms of health and resources and information and politics and social rights. There's so much to attend to when one wakes up in the morning, but then we have to remember that there's this really, like water that's flown over Riverstone. There's a path that is there, that's a groove that's set up. And if we can trust that we're on that path and trust that the path has its own wisdom, the footsteps from that path lead to a kind of wisdom. So I hope that all who do practice yoga today, I certainly feel this way myself, are on the wisdom path.
Well, I appreciate that so much. I think that's something I've been talking a lot about with people, especially right now. There was a big kind of move. I don't know if it was a big move. There was a big movement within yoga before the pandemic hit to legitimize yoga with science, which I don't think is a bad thing per se. You can certainly look at yoga through a scientific lens, and I think that's of real value. But at the same time, there was almost a little bit of a devaluing of what I found most interesting, which had to do with more of the contemplative aspects or the things that maybe science can't explain. And those aspects of practice really feel like they do require a certain amount of, I don't know, is it faith or trust or belief? Because I certainly had experiences that give me confidence in that, even though you can't prove it through a double-blind placebo study or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it's hard to come to faith, today, to trust, because of all of the splintering and fragmentation of, it seems, of the ground below us. But on the other hand, Shraddha, that the trust is paramount. And where does that come from? I think it comes from direct experience that, of embodying wisdom and being able to return to it. And I mean, this suggests, kindness and patience. And I think kind of seeing from a bird's eye view that it's easy to get really tunnel visioned into, numbers of cases of the coronavirus in Massachusetts or New Mexico. And at the same time, we need to, if possible, see, through time that there are always struggles, there are always wars and pandemics and setbacks. And so I think trust comes from having that long view through the third eye.
Well, I wrote some words down when you were speaking. I wrote direct experience. And that seems to me to be true, that when it's like coming out of your own observed experience, there's a truth to that. And I guess I'm curious about your direct experience. I've never had a chance to study with you in person, and I know you go way back. So maybe you can tell us, what were your earliest influences? Like, when did yoga kind of start for you in your life?
Well, I guess I came to it because I was an athlete. So I really have been embodied for many years. I was also a dancer. I trained with a modern dance company. I mean, I was always the peon at the back, following the lithe women in front of me, and my feet were always too far turned in. But I've been involved in the arts for many years, and so I started really in a very physical practice, very rigorous power type practice, and have really gone through, so many iterations in my journey, where now looking back, I really feel like I'm in this sort of second, the second phase of second half, really, of my own journey, that is far away from the very sort of physical, sweatband and towel
Mm-hmm.
approach of my earlier years, that it's much more subtle.
Well, I think you're not the only one who has had that kind of progression. I think there was when I first came to yoga, it was in the early 90s in New York, and it still had that kind of, I don't know, 60s vibe to it where advanced met inner peace. Like I got into yoga because I was messed up inside and I wanted to feel peace inside myself. But at some point, advanced became about poses.
Mm.
And a lot of us, I think, rode that wave and have like pictures of ourselves from like 10, 15 years ago that we might cringe at right now, So,
Yeah.
when you started, it was in the 80s?
Yeah, I started in the mid '80s. That's right. I was in Amherst, Massachusetts, and then I was started in the Iyengar system. Really, learning the alignment detail, which is so brilliant. And then, of course, was really invested later in Ashtanga Vinyasa. Spent time in Mysore with Patabi Joyce, and but then I started investing a lot in the more meditative, contemplative practices, and have sat with a Tibetan teacher, a Dzogchen teacher in the Vajrayana teachings named Sokni Rinpoche for the last 10 years. And then really so much of my emphasis somatically has been around really fine minutia, involving cranial work and the Rolfing teachings and Feldenkrais. So I'm really a mutt, of course, I think Americans, we're all mutts, influenced by so many different strands. And I love that interdisciplinary approach. I still very much in favor of the kind of polytheistic approach to study and learning. But I think, regarding the power, I really identified. I had so many identifications with my body as a very strong yoga practitioner, and it's taken me a good 10, 15 years to wean myself off of those identifications, because they were quite important to me at a certain time.
Well, I think, again, those were, I don't know how we earned credibility, almost like you could do stuff physically that other people couldn't do, and you could demonstrate it and make it look easy. But it's interesting to me that you studied cranial sacral work, which I'm very intrigued by. I'm curious, when did that happen for you? Did you study cranial sacral work later, or did that happen before you got into yoga?
Well, let's see. I went ahead and studied manual therapy. So I did a massage training back in the mid '90s, and that was great to work on trigger points and myofascial constriction. And then it was like, wow, there's this other side of manual work coming out of osteopathy, which really involves listening to the spine and the cranial rhythms. And I thought, oh my gosh, the link between Sushumna and, the Kundalini and the flow of CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid, there must be some kind of link here. So I was really taken by the fluid dynamics of the cranial work early on. And I'm still a devoted student of that thinking.
I guess it's interesting to me because I almost feel like that kind of subtle work seems almost a little bit, I guess not necessarily though, in contrast to kind of like the physical rigorosity of early Iyengar and Ashtanga practice,
It is. Well, at some point, it just comes down to listening, like at the early, we don't listen. We're more striving for gain and accomplishment. And if we're in a room with mirrors, then there's all that, collective approval, and you wear the badge, you have the status of your tribe, and all of that's quite important early on to us. And then, at least for me, my journey has been a kind of long sloughing off of that skin a kind of de-identifying with all that I initially identified with as a male, swashbuckling yogi, and then it came down to really just the very fine, attunement of listening to, not only breath and pulses, but the kind of inner motivations that were driving me to get to the mat and to do handstands, and what were those inner voices. And so, yeah, I thought I might even just share a piece of this new book that it just comes out actually this month here, August of 2020. It's called The Practice is the Path.
Okay, go for it.
Does that sound okay?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I didn't get a copy, so go ahead, read us something.
Okay. So it's from a chapter called Right Effort, from the Buddhist eightfold path. Really important for yogis, of course, to work with the right effort. And so I wrote, in the second half of my practice, I've spent precious time reflecting on the origins of my own inner striver. My father was an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, as was my grandfather and father before him. Even though I was not actively raised in a church community, the Protestant ethic circulated through my bloodstream. When I first began yoga, invisible forces urged me on, motivating me into handstands and back bends. I was under the spell of familial and cultural assumptions as I strived towards gain and sought approval. These were forces that had been set in motion long ago, persuasive forces much bigger and more impactful than my short lifetime.
I appreciate that. And I certainly had a similar experience of like a reaching and a striving. I'm also really curious about how much, like at that time when you're talking about, you even referenced like the mirrors and the kind of hierarchies that were in place. There was still, the guru traditions that you studied. I believe you studied with both Mr. Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois directly. And those were like our authorities. Those were like the masters. And when I showed up at the yoga centers, there was always the altars with their pictures there. And here we are, 10, 15 years later, and almost all of them have fallen in some disgrace of one sort or another. Yeah. It's really striking, like those. And in some way, I think maybe there's a net positive, but on another level, like you've been describing for us this, I think you're not the only one, people having to really reevaluate all these things that we were taught and who taught them to us,
Well, I think that we look for approval, right? We look for approval from authority figures. Being a man, it's oftentimes the father. And so, those guru figures appear as big authority figures, and we either align and feel that they resource us further, or we might go up against them, and so there's a really deep mine shaft of need and value and desire when it comes to working with authority figures or in an authoritarian system of any kind of power. I've always been I was always a spirited kid. I was always, sort of connected to the butterflies and to the streams and to, being outdoors. And I think there's a part of me that really preserved that, the inner boy, the spirit of the child. And in some ways that's sort of outside of the whole approval. That voice of the child is outside of the need for, recognition or, approval from a guru type.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Did you ever think of Mr. Iyengar, Mr. Pattabhi Jois as your guru? Is that what you're saying? Like, I think that there's some folks who do kind of ascribe their transformative experience to the person, but sometimes that person's just a facilitator of an experience that was transformative, but it doesn't have to be linked to that person.
Yeah, I don't think that I really perceived them as all powerful. I guess, growing up as an American, especially in New England, a small collegiate town in New England, questioning authority was part of my upbringing, and so yeah, I never really kind of fell into step with allegiance that way. Although that's a tricky dance to honor and to in a sense sustain a tradition without kind of hook, line, and sinker, perhaps falling for it. So,
well, when do you remember, like, how early did it start for you when you started to question what I kind of consider to be a bit of an overemphasis on the forms, on accomplishing poses?
I guess it was when I was, hacking my way through Ashtanga yoga, when it was where when you got one pose, you then were able to continue and get the next one. It was very hierarchical.
Yeah.
And then at some point, it was kind of like running a marathon where I would hit a wall and say, what am I doing? But then I also, really encountered the Mahayana teachings, in the Buddhist practice of no attainment, or that really, that it's not about attainment. And once I was able to let myself off the hook of feeling like I had to attain, that was a huge burden off my shoulders, a huge relief, and very difficult to really see into deeply, vipassana, to see into that this isn't about getting any farther, this path. That's fairly radical in and of itself.
Well, I appreciate that. So it's like a philosophical shift, essentially. I had a similar experience where I thought at first I was supposed to like climb these 8-limbed rung ladder so that I could get to samadhi, and then I wouldn't have pain. And then I got really into non-dual tantra, where it was like, no, you don't have to climb any ladders. There's nowhere you need to get to. And that shift of like philosophical perspective really did kind of change everything in terms of what I thought yoga was and why I practiced, and then what the form of my practice looked like after that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then the philosophical or the wisdom that of course it needs to be embodied. So, how do we have that direct experience of that so it's going to permeates our cells and our diaphragm and our adrenals and thyroid? How do we really embody that? So, I'm still very much a devoted meditator. I really think resting in spacious awareness and not trying to get any further, that's a really important teaching. Where I come, or as we all do in America, from a society that emphasizes gain, and here I think maybe this time more than ever in the pandemic, it's a good opportunity to say, look, it's really not about gain, or maybe one has to gain a certain amount in order to be willing to relinquish that same striving, but yeah, being with spaciousness, resting in spaciousness I think is very healing, and so strikes right at the heart of the yoga path.
So when it starts to shift for you, I'm curious about the time it happened for me, and I think it happened for a lot of people, where maybe you're teaching a certain way, but then you have a shift inside yourself because you were already a teacher. And then at some point, you would start to change how you're teaching. And then sometimes, like, I remember when I made that shift, it was a while ago, still the industry still wanted that power thing. So trying to like sell a contemplative class became more increasingly challenging as it became more, fitness oriented.
Yeah. Well, as a teacher, I try to get out of my own way at some point and just invite the student to be in silence and space and stillness. And yeah, it takes a little training to yoke to that, or have enough patience, to want to move slowly enough to and attuned enough to silence and space and stillness. But that's the medicine. I mean, that's really the portal to healing is silence and space and stillness. And so then, as a teacher, right, we all we need to get out of our own way and let it do its good work. And so, how to put that into language? I was an English major, so I'm always, tinkering around with phrases and metaphors and analogy and bringing in the poetics of that experience, because ultimately it doesn't lend itself to any, description. So then as a teacher, how do we invite that in? And then as a teacher, it's not about me teaching you. It's really about letting it do its good work.
Well, I know that, and the teachers I've spoken with who have been making similar transitions to the ones that you're describing, a lot of it even came down to like using more invitational language. And like you said, slower. You said moving more slowly. I certainly found that to be true. Do you think that's an important element, that the classes are just too fast, that if they're so fast, you can't have those same subtle experiences?
I think so. I mean, we all get addicted to speed, the speed trap, and it's on the interstate, it's on the high speed connectivity of our devices. And so, weaning ourselves off the speed is so important. I mean, the Kali Yuga, of course, that we're in now, everything spins faster. So when we are able to slow down enough, and this in of itself is pretty radical practice of dropping into stillness and spaciousness, and no thought, is that there's a potency there. So yeah, tapping that potency comes from being willing to slow down and to take our foot off of the accelerator, to take that risk, even though it's antithetical to the high speed, internet mediated world we live in. But I think that is a real portal to the wisdom body.
And I guess the reasoning for that is that when it's simpler and slower, at least in my experience, there's just so much more room for someone to be having an experience. They're not so overwhelmed by whatever sweating or intensity. There's just more space for it, right?
There's more space, and then something can come in through the window, right? Something can come in through the open door. So a new wind can blow in. We're not so hell-bent on gaining or getting or trying to figure out. We need to just open ourselves up to grace, or to that which is outside of our own configuring. And so, I do a lot of work with dreams. I would say a good 50% of my own sadhana, my own practice is tracking the inner fears and hopes and terrors and sublime moments that come through dreams. So that's when we're really out of our own way. You're not steering your ship at all. And so then we kind of open up to really, I think, a plethora of forces, the archetypes, from the mytho-poetic tradition, the king, the lover, the princess, the tree, the lion. We open ourselves up to other forces. So yeah, if we're so in our busy brain, if we're so moving so quickly, we can't make ourselves available to the other side.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about dreams. You don't often hear people speak about that. And there was one point where I was actually like practicing some techniques and I've been having some like lucid dreaming experiences. So I'm curious about that. What sorts of things do you do? Do you like write down your dreams right afterwards, or what kind of things do you do to help you remember dreams, or like what does that entail?
Sure, certainly writing dreams down are so important because they vanish. They just evaporate within minutes after waking. So there's a routine, there's a kind of practice with that, jotting them down, and then and then sort of getting into their web. It's a whole interstitial, all these interstitial spaces that come from the dreams, and it's all, I think the dream keepers, they guide us to heal the separated self. I mean, I think just like our spleen or our liver or the fascia in our hamstring, it's keen on maintaining a kind of homeostasis, and the body has its own way of self-healing or self-regulating. So in the dream time, we go into this process of self-regulating and healing. And so the dream keepers will offer, images, scenarios, circumstances. And when we get into them, we see how separated we are. We see how we're caught in anxiety, or we're stuck at the top of a building, or we can't get our key in the door, or we lose our phone. We see how separated we are. And then there appears, the bear or the cow or the river, or the grandmother, or it's very polytheistic. The dream, the figures that are supporting us in dream can come as many different forms, which is why I consider myself really a polytheistic type. And so then we can, if we listen enough, we can tap into the teaching, the support that comes from many figures that appear in our dreams.
Wow, I love this expression, dream keepers. And I guess I have a question about that, because you even said like something comes in through the window, or there's definitely been times in my life where I felt like I received messages. And I've talked about this with some other people in the past, like, where did that message come from? Did that come from a being? Did it come from the ether? Did it come from within me? Does it matter? But you use this term dream keepers. Do you think of that as like beings who are helping us along the way? Or what did you mean when you said dream keepers?
Yeah, I think beings that are helping us along the way. I mean, it's very similar to what's called in Tibetan practice the Sambhogakaya, or the imaginary realm, right? In Sanskrit, the Vikalpa. And so, before there was internet and television, radio, what people would do is they'd go to the temples and they'd encounter these really phantasmic images of these bodhisattvas, or these enlightened figures, or these downright terrifying, forms of the ghouls and ghosts, and multi-headed characters with long fangs. And so that was this whole imaginary realm that is it's kind of just like it's like the ozone, right? It's like another layer of psyche outside of this one, where we have teacups and cars and dishwashers. We're in this realm of the imagination, and there's lots of ways to move through it. And yeah, there are signposts, there are figures that show up from our own personal history now. I've had dreams of my father who he died several years ago now. I mean, he's come back to me a number of times in dream. So we through our own personal, not the Indian or the Taoist or some foreign practice that maybe we've encountered, but really from our own direct cultural familial history, there are lots of figures that will show up. And so then it's in the soul journey that we're navigating our own personal history. And there are many supports, archetypes will show up, or what Jung called the animus or the anima will show up to help.
And what do you think is the relationship between like the imagination realm and like this phenomenal realm of teacups? Like, how do they interplay? I ask it because I've known people who've and maybe in certain ways spent too much time in the imagination realm, and then their lives have suffered and it's caused harm. So you do have to pay your rent, right?
Yeah.
So
we sometimes think of that as getting stuck in the upper chakras. That's like when we get stuck in the third eye or even the crown chakra, then we lose track of our keys. We can't write checks. We can't, figure out how to turn on our our Word, open up our Microsoft Word documents on our computer.
Get Zoom classes happening and stuff.
Exactly. So, but I think ultimately it's all mind stuff. It's all mind made. Mind made. So whether it's your teacup, or it's your grandmother who's coming back to you in a dream, or it's the image of a deity or a bodhisattva, it's all mind made. And I'm not saying it's bad in any way, but so then when we start learning, we navigate the subtle, the imaginary, or more the artistic realm, like they would in darshan, where people go to the temple in India and they stare at the image of the deity. It's very, very powerful. I don't know if you've experienced that when you go to India. It's so mind-boggling. It's like, why do all these devotees, they want to stand in front of the deity that's back there in some little womb-like hovel of a space with a little light, fluorescent light burning? What's the big deal? Well, they want to be seen by this entity, and they want to see it. And so when in dreams, when these, when your grandmother comes in, or the elk, the bull elk comes into the dream, we want to see it and be seen by it. And then through that, I think we start to shift, our subtle body starts shifting, our orientation in the world starts shifting. Lots of ways that we can start to creatively, in the imaginary realm, change.
I think it's true. I've always felt that there's certainly, like, even when people talk about subtle bodies and physical bodies, I've sometimes felt like it gets talked about in ways that doesn't match my experience. Like if someone says, doing backbending and opening your chest, like opens your heart chakra. I don't know if that's true. I know I've seen people doing backbends in ways where that it felt like it was actually closing their heart chakra more than opening it. Like just the physicality of opening your chest doesn't equal open heart chakra. That there's certainly a relationship between subtle body and physical body, but maybe it's not this like linear one-to-one correlation.
Well, that's right. So, that's a certain way in. That's what I call, really what I identify as the first half of a practice. We start to kind of identify opening of our body as a way of, being more open in the world and receptive. And then in the second half, when we start working with our, the deep waters of our psyche, then we start, really feeling into, say, shame, which is the opposite of the open heart, right? And so then, like, you have a dream, going back to the dream work, of like, I had a dream where I was, hiding in a closet, or, I was, I went to the other side of the street because I didn't want to pass this person. And so there's this sense of, wow, I'm retreating. I'm hiding in a way that has served me in the past, perhaps. But do I need to continue to hide in that way? Maybe, maybe not. So then just like opening the chest, it's like, wait a minute, what if we work with the side of us that feels shame, that needs that camouflage, that maybe even, freezes, in the fight, flight, or freeze response, that if we go into places where we're hiding and frozen. So when we're working in this deep, the deep waters of our inner psyche with these states, that's when I think we really start shifting our subtle biorhythms and so opening the heart and the backbend, that's great. That's really one of the first gates we pass through. And then there are many, many, many gates in time.
Right, but that physicality of opening your chest, it becomes like a subtle body experience when it also has this inquiry into the deep waters of your psyche that you're talking about. Isn't the subtle about that delve into the deeper waters?
It is. I think that when we delve into the deeper water, we start to see all these nuance of our own, hopes and fears and identifications and the way our self gets fragmented, or it gets built up excessively and with pride. When we start seeing those nuances, that's vipassana, right? So then we start to see into all of the ways that our self is constructed, and then we have choice. Then we have choice. Well, I could go back like I did in my dream to this place of hiding, or I could step out. But I think once I feel what it's like to be the hider, when I work with the one who has needed to hide, and I can really feel what that's like, then when I do come out, it has a different quality than just opening my chest and coming out. I've kind of worked with my wound. I've touched into the place where I've had to sort of play possum or, camouflage myself. There's a different feeling when we've worked through our pain, worked through our wound. Quite important.
Well, I so appreciate this because it is a shift, because there was such an emphasis placed. Like if you look at the way yoga teacher training happened, and like the 5 teaching points for down dogs or whatever, that it became like it's very hard to standardize what you're talking about in order to get to the aspects of practice that you're pointing to. As you stated earlier, it really does need to be like more artistic and poetic, and it has to be an individual inquiry that someone takes inside themselves. And that that can't really be a standardized process.
You're right. You can't codify it and like put it in a teacher training manual. Really.
I know, but we've been trying to do that for like 2 decades or something. Is what I'm saying. You can't.
Sure. Well, yoga is really, of course, mixed up with the marketplace and the capitalist enterprise, of course. And so, I don't know how many millions of dollars are spent a year on yoga and trainings. And, I've done it too. I've to an extent, although I've resisted it, codifying my work. But, when we start really getting into
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.